I never meant to take a wife. I was just trying to help her. The station was falling apart when I found her. Power flickered in and out, the air stale with recycled failure, walls groaning under the weight of a dying orbit. I'd answered a distress beacon, expecting corpses or if I was lucky salvage. But instead, I found her. She was locked in a containment bay, curled up beneath a flickering light, her copper-toned skin glowing faintly in the dark. Her wrists were bound with blinking silver bands. I'd seen devices like those before on backwater planets and illegal trafficking routes. Control tech. Slave restraints. I acted without thinking. My cutter made quick work of the first bracelet, then the second. They clattered to the floor. I expected gratitude, relief, even confusion. Instead, she cried. Not the kind of quiet, grateful tears I'd seen from rescued victims. These were sharp and trembling, like something sacred had been broken. She covered her wrists with shaking hands and backed away from me like I'd stabbed her. "What's wrong?" I asked, more alarmed by her reaction than anything I'd seen on that cursed station. She looked at me with wide, glassy eyes, her voice a whisper so fragile I almost missed it. "You've claimed me," she said. I blinked. "I what?" Her hands lifted, revealing the raw skin where the bracelets had once been. "In my culture," she said slowly, "those weren't shackles. They were purity bands. Sacred. They signify one's vow to remain untouched until they bond with their chosen mate. When someone removes them..." She didn't need to finish. I felt the words lodge in my throat like glass. I'd just married a stranger by accident. "I didn't know," I said, stumbling back a step. "I thought dash." "I know what you thought," she said, her voice trembling with the effort to stay composed. "But it doesn't change what's done. My name is Rex Maddox. Ex-Marine. Interstellar courier. Professional loner. And as of 20 minutes ago, according to the ancient vows of a people I knew nothing about, I had a wife." But what struck me most wasn't the absurdity of the situation. It was the look in her eyes, not anger, not accusation, but heartbreak. Not because I had forced something on her, but because I had broken something she had vowed to protect. Her name was Ori. She wasn't a slave. She was a daughter of a world with rituals I didn't understand, pride I couldn't fathom, and a heart that, somehow, I'd just stepped straight into. I didn't come to that station looking for anything more than a quick payout. But I was about to leave it with a bond one didn't choose and a truth I couldn't walk away from. I should have known better. You don't just walk into an abandoned research station and find something whole. Not out here. Not in the quiet dead of space, where things are left behind for a reason. But I'd responded to the beacon anyway, standard protocol, standard boredom, and maybe, if I was being honest, a desire to feel useful again. The kind of use that came from saving someone. Or something. I didn't expect to find a girl. She was curled in the corner of the dim maintenance bay, knees pulled to her chest, copper-toned skin catching the faint emergency lights like metal left in the sun. She didn't speak when I entered. Didn't look up. Just trembled slightly, like she wasn't sure I was real. I wasn't sure she was either. At first glance, she looked human. Mostly. But her limbs were too long, her eyes too large, and there was a quiet glow to her that I couldn't place. Alien, clearly, but familiar in the way someone else's loneliness feels when you've carried your own too long. Her wrists caught my attention next. Metallic bands, tight, polished, pulsing softly with embedded circuitry. They looked too sleek to be decorative and too secure to be voluntary. I'd seen similar tech before in the darker corners of the outer systems. High-end restraint cuffs, usually paired with mind conditioning nodes and neural governors. Slavery gear, illegal under every major interstellar charter, but that never stopped the black market syndicates. It just made them quieter. I felt my jaw tighten. My pulse shifted into something colder. "Who did this to you?" I asked. She blinked up at me slowly, then looked away. No answer. Maybe she didn't understand me, or maybe she just didn't trust me. I couldn't blame her. I was a stranger in black armor with a plasma cutter on my hip. I wouldn't have trusted me either. But I couldn't just leave her like that. I crouched, lifted her hands gently, and brought the cutter to bear. She didn't resist. Didn't even flinch. The cutter sparked once, twice, and the first band fell to the floor with a small metallic clatter. The second followed moments later. I reached out instinctively, about to check for burns where the heat had kissed her skin, when her reaction stopped me cold. She pulled back sharply, covering her wrists like they were wounds, not freed skin. Then she began to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But with the kind of grief that hits deep and slow, like a dam breaking behind the eyes. Her shoulders trembled, her breath hitched, and she turned her face to the wall. "I'm sorry," I said, confused, trying to piece together what I'd done wrong. "I thought they were hurting you. I thought you were Dash. You thought I was a slave," she finished, her voice thick with restrained pain. "Everyone does." I hesitated. "Weren't you?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I was preserved. Protected." She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something ancient in her gaze. Not years, but heritage. Meaning. Those weren't restraints. They were vows. Symbols of purity, of intention. They're given when we come of age to honor a promise to ourselves and our future bondmate. I felt a pit open in my stomach. And removing them. She swallowed hard. It's a ritual only a life bond can perform. To remove them is to claim the person publicly, permanently. In the eyes of my people, you've chosen me. The silence that followed was unbearable. My breath caught somewhere between guilt and disbelief. I'd come to save someone and instead, I'd taken something sacred. Irrevocably. "I didn't know," I said, the words small and broken in the vast quiet of the station. "I would never dash." "I know," she whispered, but there was no comfort in it. Just quiet devastation. Intentions don't matter. Not in tradition. The act is the vow. I sat back on my heels, staring at the two hollow bracelets on the floor. The lights in them had dimmed. Dead now. Like what they once represented. Her name was Ori. She said it simply, like it was a fragment of something once beautiful and now abandoned. "My people will no longer see me as worthy," she said. "You're the only one who can complete the bond now. If you walk away, I will carry the shame of that forever." I looked at her, this woman I didn't know, whose life I'd upended with one stupid, well-intentioned gesture. And what I saw wasn't weakness. It wasn't submission. It was someone trying to hold onto dignity with bloodied fingers. Someone who had built a future around a tradition she believed in, only to have it shattered by a stranger with a savior complex and a hot blade. I thought I was setting her free. Instead, I'd made her mine. Not by her choice. Not by mine. But by the cold laws of her people's heart, passed down through generations like the stars themselves. The rescue wasn't a rescue. It was a bond neither of us had asked for, but one that would bind us all the same. And somewhere, beneath the shame and confusion and broken ritual, I realized I didn't want to leave her behind. Not because of guilt, but because something in me already knew this moment wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something bigger than both of us. I spent the first night in silence. Ori stayed in the auxiliary quarters of the Vigilant Dawn, the small chamber just off the med bay, where spare linens and a fold-out bed had never seen actual use. I'd offered her the captain's quarters. She refused with a quiet shake of her head. She hadn't spoken much since the incident. Just gave me her name, her planet of origin Illyria, a world I'd heard of only in passing, and a look in her eyes that said everything else was still off limits. I couldn't blame her. I didn't know how to speak to someone I'd accidentally married. But I wanted to understand. Not just what I'd done, but why it mattered so deeply. So I started with a question. The next morning, after breakfast had come and gone untouched, I found her in the viewport corridor, staring at the stars. "I don't understand," I said, careful to keep my voice low. "Not just the bracelets, but all of it? Why would something like that carry so much weight?" She didn't turn, but I saw her reflection in the glass, saw the tightening of her jaw, the way her arms crossed, not out of defiance, but like she was holding herself together. "They weren't just ornaments," she said. "And they weren't for anyone else. The bracelets were for me." I waited. "In my culture," she continued, "we begin wearing them at the age of first light around 15, in Earth years. There's a ceremony. Family, community, all gathered. It's not a celebration of ownership. It's a declaration of self." She finally turned, her eyes meeting mine. They were impossibly deep, flecks of green in a sea of copper, like polished metal reflecting stars. "Each bracelet is encoded with our biological signature and a series of neural pulses. When worn, they serve as a constant, physical reminder of our intention, to preserve our emotional, physical, and spiritual energy for the one we one day choose to share it with." "Like a vow?" I asked gently. "Yes," she said. "But more than that. They're not meant to restrain. They're meant to focus. The bands help us regulate emotion, balance hormonal fluctuations, even calm the body in times of stress. It's not purity in the way humans think of it. It's clarity. Purpose." That made my stomach twist. I'd imagined them as shackles. Cold, metallic symbols of oppression. But to her, they were something sacred. A tool for self-governance, self-awareness, self-respect. "I thought I was setting you free," I said. "But I destroyed something that was part of you." She looked away again. "You didn't destroy it. But you ended it. And in doing so, you triggered the ritual's fulfillment." "How does that work?" Her shoulders lifted in a small breath, the kind that felt like it hurt to take. "The removal of the bracelets, when done by another, signals the end of the vow. It is only meant to happen when two partners have chosen each other. It's the final moment in the bond ceremony. We remove them together, and then place new bands, shared bands, onto each other's wrists. It's symbolic. The old self fades. The new begins." "But I didn't know," I said. "I didn't choose you. Not like that." "I know." Her voice was a whisper. "But the tradition doesn't account for ignorance. The act itself seals the intent." I leaned against the wall, letting her words sink in. It wasn't just a cultural difference. It was the misalignment of worlds, two systems of meaning that overlapped at the worst possible moment. On Earth, gestures were fluid. Context mattered. You could apologize, explain. But on Illyria, action was law. Ritual was binding. Not just legally, but spiritually. What happens now? I asked. What would your people expect? Ori turned to me fully now, and I saw something different in her expression. Not just sadness but resignation. You are now my bonded, she said. By ancient right, by public act. It doesn't matter that there was no witness. The station's AI recorded the removal, logged the event. If we were to return to Illyria now, they would celebrate the union. And if I walked away? Her voice cracked, barely audible. I would live out my days untethered. Dishonored. No one else would offer a bond. My vow would be broken, my value, gone. The silence between us was thick. Heavy with implication. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated. A quiet understanding of the damage done not by malice, but by misreading something sacred. But it's not just about what they think, she added, almost to herself. It's what I feel. I wasn't ready. I hadn't chosen. You were a stranger. And now I have to live with the consequences of that moment. I stepped closer, just enough to close the space between us. I don't want to force you into anything, I said. And I'm not expecting you to feel something just because a tradition says so. But I made this mess. If there's a way to honor what I broke to rebuild it, somehow I want to try. She looked up at me then, really looked. And for a breath, neither of us were human or Illyrian, rescuer, or rescued. We were just two people in the void, caught between meaning and mistake, searching for something to hold onto. You can't fix it, she said softly. But you can walk with me through what comes next. I nodded. Then that's what I'll do. Her lips quirked almost a smile, but not quite. The bracelets were gone. The vow was broken. But maybe, just maybe, something new had begun. Not by tradition. Not by force. But by choice. Love wasn't something I believed in. Not really. Not in the poetic, faded sense. I'd spent most of my adult life alone by design, wandering from star to star, contract to contract, never staying long enough for anything to matter. And when things did start to matter, I ran. Simpler that way. Cleaner. No entanglements, no guilt when it all inevitably broke apart. So when I told Ori I'd stay with her after the accident with the bracelets, I meant it as a gesture of honor, an attempt to right a wrong, not an invitation to feel. But feelings don't ask for permission. They sneak in slowly. At first, I thought it was just sympathy. A kind of compassion for someone caught in a cultural net that I had unknowingly cast. She was quiet, reserved, and a little too graceful to belong in the gritty reality of ship corridors and fuel reports. She moved like someone trained in stillness. Not submissive, never that, but measured. Every word she spoke was intentional, and every silence had shape. I'd never met anyone like her. We started small. Meals shared in silence at first, then broken by simple questions. What's your homeworld like? Do all Terran ships smell like engine oil and recycled air? Why do humans laugh when they're nervous? I'd answer awkwardly, sometimes with humor, sometimes with honesty, and she would listen. Always. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush to fill the space. It was unnerving at first how fully she could be present, but eventually, it became something else. It became grounding. She asked me one night, as we watched a dying sun fade behind a drifting asteroid field, if I ever regretted living the way I did. I told her no. That I'd chosen this life for a reason. Freedom, independence, the ability to leave whenever I needed. She nodded, but didn't smile. Then she said, "Freedom is a beautiful thing. But it can grow cold without warmth to come back to." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The silence between us said everything. The ship began to change. Or maybe I changed within it. I started noticing the little things. How she would hum softly in the morning while recalibrating the sensors. How she always made enough tea for two, even before I admitted I liked the taste of hers better than the bitter coffee I used to live on. How she began personalizing the co-pilot seat, adding a woven sash from her home world across the headrest, adjusting the display tones to softer hues that made the space feel less like a weapon and more like a place where someone could belong. And somehow, I found myself wanting her to belong. The shift came subtly. One day we were running diagnostics together, and her hand brushed mine. Just a flicker of contact, skin on skin, no more than a second. But I felt it. Like static. Like breath caught in the middle of a thought. I looked up, and so did she, and in that moment we both knew something had changed. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But everything felt louder after that. Every footstep. Every glance. Every shared space charged with the potential of something neither of us knew how to name. We never talked about the bond. Not directly. The ancient Aeolian tradition still hung between us like a curtain half drawn. I hadn't asked for it. She hadn't chosen me. But it was there, undeniable, and the longer we spent together, the more it began to feel less like a mistake and more like inevitability. What surprised me most was the way she began to open. Slowly, like a flower unsure of the sun. She told me stories about her childhood, how her mother used to weave stories into the fabric of their blankets, hiding parables in patterns. How her father taught her the stars, not as destinations but as companions. She showed me how to trace constellations with my fingers and how to tell time by the rhythm of a ship's hum. In return, I gave her pieces of myself I hadn't touched in years. I told her about my first mission off Earth, how I nearly threw up during drop because I'd never felt gravity give way before. About the firefight that got me discharged. About the friend I couldn't save. She didn't judge. Didn't try to fix it. She just listened, her eyes wide and soft, and when I finally stopped speaking, she simply said, "You carry your pain like armor. But it doesn't have to protect you from me." I think that was the moment I knew. It wasn't a grand epiphany. No romantic declarations or sudden realizations. Just a quiet truth settling into my bones. I didn't want her to leave. I didn't want this to end when the technical marriage cycle ran its course. I wanted more days like this. More nights under unfamiliar stars. More moments of accidental laughter, quiet understanding, and shared breath. I found myself watching her more, studying the way her eyes searched the stars, the curve of her mouth when she tried not to smile, the way she held her breath just before speaking something vulnerable. Every time she walked into the room, something shifted in me. A tension eased. A wall lowered. And slowly, carefully, I began to let her in. Not because tradition demanded it, but because something in me had started to believe she belonged here. With me. Not by accident. Not because of a vow sealed by ignorance. but because, somewhere along the way, we had begun choosing each other. Day by day. In small, quiet ways. Falling for her wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a crash. It was a drift, a gravitational pull I didn't resist. And maybe that's what made it real. It was unexpected. But it was everything. The truth came to us quietly, like a storm you don't see until it's already overhead. It started with a salvage job. Just another side mission. Ori and I had intercepted a drifting courier pod while passing through the remnants of an old orbital trade route. Standard procedure: secure the pod, scan for data, check for anything worth reselling or decoding. But what we found inside wasn't just forgotten cargo, it was a data shard marked with a classified Alliance seal. Deep encryption. Civilian terminals wouldn't have cracked it. But Ori, with her calm precision and uncanny intuition, cracked it open in under an hour. She called me to the bridge in a voice I didn't recognize. Not fear, exactly. Not urgency. Something closer to disbelief laced with something colder. Hurt. When I entered, she didn't turn to look at me. She just tapped a single command, and the projection bloomed into the air between us. A man's face, Terran, mid-40s, lean and clinical in a lab coat, his voice clipped, confident, detached. Project Arc 92. Subject bonding proceeding as predicted. Neural tethering syncs with cultural markers at a 92% compliance rate. Emotional programming holds. Host species remains unaware of behavioral conditioning framework. My mind stalled. I heard the words, but I couldn't quite process them. The scientist continued, explaining how the bracelets, those same ones I had cut from Ori's wrists, were not an ancient cultural heirloom after all. Not fully. Not entirely. They were engineered. Designed. Coded with behavioral guidance protocols. Manufactured by Terran Labs. Worse, the data logs confirmed what Ori had feared in the quietest parts of herself. Her people had been studied, mapped, their traditions twisted not through conquest, but through infiltration. The bracelets weren't just a rite. They were a means of control, disguised as devotion. And the Aelirians had accepted it, preserved it, passed it down over generations, never knowing it had been implanted into their very sense of self by an outside hand. I turned to Ori then, but she wasn't looking at the projection anymore. She was staring at her wrists. At the faint, smooth circles where the bands had once rested. She rubbed at the skin as if she could scrub the truth off. Ori, I said carefully. But she raised a hand. Not to push me away, just to pause. To keep the moment from breaking apart too quickly. I wore them my whole life, she said. Her voice was low, steady, but there was a thin edge to it. My mother fastened them onto me during the first light ceremony. I remember how proud she was. How proud I was. I believed they made me strong. Disciplined. Whole. Her fingers curled into fists. They weren't a tradition. They were a program. I thought I was choosing to wait. Choosing restraint. Choosing honor. But I wasn't choosing at all. She finally turned to face me. And neither were the thousands of others who wore them. There was no accusation in her eyes, but there was something worse, grief shaped by clarity. A grief that came not from loss, but from betrayal. She had built her entire identity around something she thought was sacred. And now she saw the hands behind the curtain. Terran hands. My people. I reached for her instinctively, but hesitated. I didn't want to comfort her with platitudes. She didn't need apology. She needed truth. I didn't know, I said finally. I swear it, Ori. I didn't know what they were. I thought. I know, she interrupted, softer now. You didn't do this. But it doesn't change what was done. She walked to the viewport, crossing her arms over her chest, her reflection merging with the stars beyond. You cut them off, she said. And I thought you'd ruined me. That you'd broken something precious. But you didn't. You uncovered something that was already broken. You set fire to a lie I didn't know I was living. I approached slowly, standing beside her. For a long time, we said nothing. Just watched the stars spin silently around us, like they were waiting. What happens now? I asked. She let out a breath that trembled slightly at the end. We tell the others, she said. We find out how far this went. How many worlds? How many species? We find out who authorized it. And we stop them. You want to go after the Alliance? I asked, not in disbelief, but in awe. Ori, that's not a fair fight. No, she said, turning to me with new steel in her gaze. It's not. But it's the only one worth fighting. I saw something shift in her then. The quiet grace that had defined her since the moment we met had crystallized into resolve. She wasn't the same woman who had once whispered her shame to me in the belly of a forgotten station. She was something new now. Something free. But it wasn't vengeance burning in her. It wasn't rage. It was clarity. They didn't just manipulate our minds, she said. They rewrote our stories. Our history. Our sense of self. And I'm going to reclaim it. And in that moment, I knew. Our bond hadn't been forged in ignorance. It had been forged in fire. Not because I claimed her, not because I removed those bracelets, but because we stood together now, stripped of illusion, both staring into the same darkness and choosing to walk forward anyway. I reached for her hand, and this time, she took it. The stars were still out there. The fight was waiting. But so was the truth. And we were done running from it. There are moments in life that do not announce themselves with sound or fury. They arrive quietly, like a breath held too long, and in their stillness, they change everything. That's how it was between Ori and me after the truth about the bracelets shattered the world she thought she knew. It didn't explode into shouting or blame. It settled like dust over everything: our ship, our bond, our silence. We didn't speak for nearly 2 days. Not out of anger. But because neither of us had the words yet to carry the weight of what we'd learned. Ori moved through the corridors of the vigilant dawn with a different rhythm, like someone trying to inhabit a body that no longer felt like hers. I gave her space, checking systems, and rerouting our travel plan with mechanical precision, though my thoughts never left her. She had been raised in a culture shaped by faith, tradition, and a belief in self-discipline, not as submission, but as strength. And now she knew that foundation had been seeded not by ancestors, but by outsiders. By us. By my people. The very act that had marked her identity, the bracelets, the vow, the ritual of bonding, wasn't born of her own world but was instead embedded by foreign science, wrapped in manipulation, hidden behind reverent language and ceremony. When she finally came to me, it was late. The stars outside were slow and distant, the kind that don't seem to move even when everything inside you does. She stood in the threshold of the bridge, her arms crossed, the shadows of the star map flickering across her face. "I've been thinking," she said. I turned in my chair but didn't rise. She wasn't here for comfort. She was here for clarity. I've spent my entire life believing in something sacred, she continued. Not just the bracelets, but everything they represented. I believed restraint was strength. I believed patience had purpose. That the vow to wait to preserve meant something powerful. And now I know it was engineered. Placed in our society like a seed, watered by propaganda and silence, until we thought we'd grown it ourselves. Her voice didn't tremble. It had no edge. It was steady, quiet, and devastating. I feel like a stranger in my own memory. I didn't know what to say, so I offered the only truth I had. You still have your strength, Ori. That was never engineered. She gave a small nod, then stepped forward, placing something in my hands. 2 small fragments of metal, smooth, silver, cold. The remnants of her bracelets, the ones I had cut without understanding, without consent. These are what remain, she said. Not just of my vow, but of everything I believed defined me. I looked down at the pieces. They were too small to hold meaning anymore, but they carried the weight of something sacred. Broken, yes. But still real. Still hers. What do you want to do? I asked her. That's when she met my eyes. I want to fight. I wasn't expecting that. Not from her. Not from the woman who once whispered her shame through tears in the dark. But the woman before me now was not the same. She had been remade by truth. Not hardened, but clarified. There was no vengeance in her voice, only purpose. I want to find who started Project Arc 92. I want to know who approved it, who designed it, who deployed it into the roots of my people's culture and walked away like we were a test subject on a spreadsheet. I want to know how many other species were touched, how many worlds were rewritten under the guise of tradition. And then, she said, we bring it down. I took a breath, because the weight of what she was saying wasn't small. It wasn't a single mission. It wasn't even revenge. It was war. A quiet one. A shadow war. The kind that lives in secrets and whispers, and if you're lucky, in change. She knelt in front of me, hands still holding the metal fragments. I don't ask you this as you're bonded, she said. Not as someone caught in ritual or accident. I ask as me. As Ori. The person I am now, beyond programming, beyond vow, beyond shame. Will you help me? There was no hesitation in my answer. Yes. Not because I owed her. Not because of guilt. But because of choice. Because I had watched her carry the weight of revelation without collapsing. Because I had fallen for her not as a symbol, but as a person. Because what had started between us by accident had become real. Then we start here, she said. We spent the next week tracking old research stations, decoding files, connecting names to shell corporations and black ops labs. We found references to early ARC prototypes in buried alliance contracts, and mentions of cultural adaptation models in long-abandoned sociological databases. Every answer opened another door. And every door led to more shadows. But we walked through them together. One night, while she worked in the data bay and I calibrated the drive systems, she came to me holding a small chain she had crafted from the fragments of her bracelets. I don't want to wear them again, she said. But I want to remember. Not what they meant before. What they mean now. She looped the chain into my palm, then closed my fingers around it. They represent the moment everything changed. I pressed the chain to my heart. They represent the moment we began. And it was true. We had been fractured. by culture, by truth, by forces older and colder than either of us. But in that fracture, we had found the space to choose. Not just to love, but to fight. Together. And that was a bond no tradition could define. The decision to stay wasn't made in a single moment. It wasn't some grand, romantic gesture. It didn't come with fireworks or sweeping declarations under starlight. It came quietly, between breaths, between battles, in the way we moved around each other. It came in the days after the truth shattered everything Ori thought she knew about her past, and in the nights when we said nothing at all, choosing instead to sit side by side in the pilot's cabin, watching the stars roll by like ancient witnesses. We had seen what the world could do to faith. How something sacred could be hijacked, programmed, re-engineered into a system of compliance. But we had also learned something else, something more personal. That meaning, once stolen, could be taken back. That love, once manipulated, could still be rewritten into something authentic. Something ours. Ori never asked me to make anything official. She didn't demand vows or recognition or restitution. She only asked for presence. Honesty. Partnership. And I gave her that without hesitation, because what we had built from the wreckage of tradition felt stronger than anything either of us had known before. It began with the bracelets. Not the ones I had cut. Those were long gone, scattered in pieces across the void, melted in the wake of a truth too heavy to wear. But Ori had taken what remained two curved fragments of metal and reshaped them into something new. Not for herself, but for both of us. We stood on the observation deck of a small moon base outpost, our ship refueling in the distance, and she placed the object in my hand. It was a chain, forged from the remnants of the bracelets, fused with a strip of copper wire from our ship's internal power line, something mundane, something ours. It was elegant, rough, imperfect. Real. This, she said, is not a symbol of purity. It is not a vow dictated by anyone else. It is a memory of who I was, and a declaration of who I am now. And if you'll accept it, I want it to represent what we're choosing together. My hands closed around it before I even spoke. She didn't need to ask twice. What we were building was not about ceremony. It was not about culture. It was about reclaiming the right to define ourselves. To say, this is who I am, and this is who I choose. Not because of fate. Not because of programming. But because, even in the vast cold emptiness of space, we had found something worth holding onto. We returned to her home world weeks later. Not to seek approval. Not to explain ourselves. But to stand where it all began. Proxima 3 hadn't changed. The air was still dry and sharp with desert winds. The stars still hung low in the sky, closer than they should have been. But the people were different. Or perhaps we were. Ori walked through the dusty outpost like a woman no longer bound by past expectations, and they watched her not with judgment, but with something close to reverence. Not because she had returned with a Terran husband, but because she had returned with clarity in her stride. We stayed long enough to help them understand what had been done. She spoke to the elders, shared the data we had uncovered, the files, the footage, the records of manipulation. Some resisted. Others wept. Many simply listened. It wasn't an easy conversation. Nothing that overturns centuries of tradition ever is. But it was a beginning. Not of rebellion. Not of destruction. But of reclamation. A slow, careful reaching toward the truth, and toward the freedom that comes with it. That night, under the twin moons of her world, Ori and I stood alone beneath the sky. "We never finished the ritual," she said. "Not properly." "We don't have to," I replied. "I want to," she said, gently. "But this time, our way." She reached into her cloak and pulled out 2 new bands. They weren't metallic. They weren't embedded with tech or designed by ancient rite. They were simple braided cords, woven from local desert fiber and a strand of her own hair, paired with a thread from my flight jacket. Personal. Honest. Imperfect. She tied one around my wrist, slow and deliberate, her fingers steady. "I choose you," she said. "Not because of ritual. Not because of mistake. But because in you, I see a future I want to live in." I tied the other around hers, my voice low. "I choose you," I said. "Not because of guilt. Not because of tradition. But because you are the most remarkable person I've ever known, and I will spend my life learning how to deserve you." No witnesses. No ceremony. Just the stars, the desert wind, and the weight of 2 people finally saying yes, not to obligation, but to each other. We left Proxima 3 the next day, our ship a little heavier with supplies, a little lighter with doubt. The journey ahead wasn't simple. There was still work to be done, other species to warn, more buried truths to uncover. The fight against Arc 92 was far from over. But we no longer traveled as 2 people bound by accident. We traveled as a team. As a partnership. As a bond we had taken back from the hands of those who tried to define it for us. And that made all the difference. Because sometimes, the most sacred vows are the ones we invent ourselves, spoken not in temples, but in starships, in silence, in the quiet courage of choosing each other day after day. Not as tradition demands, but as love deserves. Maybe it started with a misunderstanding. Maybe it began with a mistake. But the truth is, the story of Ori and Rex is not about error, it's about what we do after the error. It's about how 2 people from entirely different worlds, caught in an unintentional bond, chose not to run from it, but to face it, question it, and ultimately reclaim it on their own terms. To the modern American audience, especially those navigating adulthood between the ages of 18 and 50, this story isn't just science fiction, it's reflection. In a world where so much of who we are is influenced by systems we didn't build, where traditions and expectations are handed to us before we know what we truly believe, there is something profoundly human about realizing that we can stop, re-evaluate, and choose again. We've all been there, haven't we? Following inherited beliefs or societal roles because they were presented as truth, as the way things are. Whether it's in relationships, culture, family, or even how we define success, we often find ourselves living inside narratives we didn't write. And then something happens, sometimes small, sometimes shattering, and suddenly, we're left asking the same question Ori asked when she learned the truth: who am I if this isn't real? What do I believe now? The beauty of the story is in its answer. You begin again. You gather the broken pieces, not to mourn what was lost, but to build something stronger, more honest, and entirely your own. Ori and Rex didn't pretend the past didn't happen. They didn't erase their pain. Instead, they looked it in the eye, honored what was meaningful, discarded what was false, and crafted something real together. This isn't just about romantic love, though their journey certainly carries that weight. It's about the broader, deeper kind of love, the kind that comes from mutual respect, vulnerability, and shared growth. It's about healing through understanding. Fighting for truth. Choosing connection even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's uncertain, because you know that the risk is worth the reward of something real. For anyone watching, reading, or listening, you're not defined by what was handed to you. You're not bound by past choices, family scripts, or cultural expectations. Like Ori and Rex, you can rewrite the rules. You can redefine love, loyalty, identity, even purpose. The future doesn't belong to those who follow old paths blindly. It belongs to those brave enough to ask, "Is this mine?" and courageous enough to walk a new one if the answer is no. In a galaxy shaped by force and control, their story reminds us that the most powerful revolution begins not with rebellion, but with the quiet, steady act of choosing for ourselves. And that is a story worth telling.